There are places where the moment you set foot, you know immediately that this place is holding something. Not knowing through your eyes, not knowing through your ears, but knowing through something deeper, something older, living in the part of a person that science has not yet found a name for. My name is Khanh. That year, I was 32 years old, a civil engineer for an infrastructure company in the city. My job was to go to places where people wanted to build roads, survey the terrain, take soil samples, draw maps, then go back and write reports. I had done this work in dozens of different villages over 5 years. Nothing worth mentioning ever happened, until I came to Dong Am. The bus from the city heading toward Dong Am took nearly 4 hours. I sat by the window. Outside, rice fields stretched flat under the light of late afternoon, the yellow of ripe grain mixed with the gray of low clouds, everything bleeding into each other at the horizon like a painting someone had dipped in water. Houses along the road grew sparse, then sparser, then disappeared entirely behind patches of Kajuput forest, standing still as rows of faceless soldiers. In my bag on the seat beside me, alongside a box of soil samples from the previous project and a set of surveying tools, there was a piece of paper. That piece of paper had been in my bag for 15 years. Worn, fraying at the corners, folded and refolded so many times, the creases had gone soft and thin, as though they might tear through. On it was an address. The address of a cemetery in another province. The address of where my mother lay. My mother passed when I was 17. Cancer. She died in a hospital far from home, far from our hometown. I remember that hospital room had the smell of alcohol and medicine mixed together. The smell of a place where people come to try to hold on to life, but usually cannot. I remember the sound of machines beeping steadily in the dark. The sound of a nurse's shoes in the hallway outside, her steps careful and quieted so as not to wake the patients, but still making that small, hollow sound that I listened to all night and could not stop listening to. That last night, my mother lay there, her hand holding mine. Her eyes looked up at the hospital ceiling, that pale white ceiling that millions of people had looked up at before her, and millions more would look up at after. She said the only sentence I would remember for the rest of my life: "Don't forget me." I did not forget. But I had also never visited her grave. 15 years. I kept that piece of paper, carried it everywhere, but never once went to the address written on it. Not because I was busy, not because the distance was too far, but because I was afraid. Afraid to stand before that grave and admit to myself that for 15 years, my mother had been lying there alone while I kept living, kept working, kept passing through each day as though she had never existed. The bus stopped at the crossroads at the edge of Dong Am village just before 4 in the afternoon. I picked up my bag and stepped down. And the first thing I noticed was not the scenery, not the road, not the houses lined up along the path. It was the silence. Not the ordinary silence of a countryside afternoon. A countryside afternoon usually has the sound of chickens clucking behind fences, dogs barking in the distance, carrying across the fields, children calling each other back and forth on the dirt paths. The silence here was different, denser, heavier, as though it was not sound that was absent, but sound that was being held somewhere, not permitted to escape. And there was a smell, faintly sour, faintly stale, not strong, but persistent, drifting in the afternoon wind, like an uninvited guest who had settled in and would not leave. Not the smell of wet earth after rain, not the smell of ripe grain, not the smell of evening cooking smoke that other villages usually carried. This was something older than all of those. Like the smell of paper yellowed over decades, of rotting wood in a dark corner of an old house, of something that had existed too long and was beginning to dissolve back into dirt. Later, after I had grown used to Dong Am, I understood what that smell was. It was the smell of the cemetery. It had soaked into the soil of this village, into the water, into the air, into the sleep of everyone who had lived here from one generation to the next. They no longer smelled it. But I, a stranger who had just stepped off a bus with a bag of surveying tools and a piece of paper bearing his mother's cemetery address at the bottom of his bag, I smelled it immediately.
Mrs. Tu Huang's house sat about 200 meters from the slope at the end of the village. 3 rooms, built from handmade brick that had faded to a deep brown with the years, the old yin-yang roof tiles covered in patches of green moss. The front yard had a few clumps of yellow marigolds that the dry season dust had dulled to something older than their actual color. A house that had learned how to exist for a very long time without needing much. Mrs. Tu met me at the gate. Thin and small, her back already bent by the years, white hair pinned neatly back. The smile on her lips was gentle, but it did not reach her eyes. She looked at me from head to foot, then looked past me toward the slope at the end of the village, where the cemetery lay behind a thin stand of kajuput trees, as though checking whether I had brought anything back from that direction. The sitting room was low and dim, even with the windows open. The afternoon light refused to come in deep, only standing at the threshold before pulling back like a hesitant visitor. On the altar shelf in the corner of the room, old incense smoke had settled in a thin film over incense holders packed with burned sticks, creating a faint smell of sandalwood mixed with the stale outdoor air drifting in through the window gaps. We sat and drank tea. Green tea, dense and bitter, poured into 2 small porcelain cups already chipped at the rims, the edges cracked in fine lines, like old, dry earth. Steam rose from the cups in faint curls in the afternoon light. I asked about the village, about the road being planned, about what to be careful of when surveying the surrounding area. She answered evenly, her voice carrying the slight roughness of someone who had been through many seasons. Then I asked about the cemetery. She set her teacup down. The sound of porcelain meeting the wooden table surface was small and dry and final. Her hands rested on the table, trembling very slightly, not much, just enough for someone paying attention to notice. "Very large," she said, her voice dropping 1 register. Then she looked directly into my eyes for the first time in our conversation. "Do not go into the cemetery after 6 in the evening, and never call out anyone's name while you are in there." I was about to ask more. She had already stood up, said she needed to start cooking, turned her back and walked toward the kitchen. From behind her, the wood fire in the kitchen stove began to catch, the smell of wood smoke rising warm and familiar. But underneath that smoke, the stale smell from outside was still there, lingering, patient. The room she had prepared for me was in the right wing. An old wooden bed with grain lines, dark as river channels running along the planks, a small table, a window looking out over the back garden. The back garden was planted with jackfruit and longan trees, their canopies thick enough to block most of the sky, filtering the light down into small, pale fragments scattered across the damp ground. The room was always submerged in a dim and uncertain light, half day, half dark, as though it occupied the border between 2 things I had not yet found the name for. That first night, I could not sleep. Not because the bed was unfamiliar, not because of frogs in the fields, because in Dong Am there were no frogs, though the village was surrounded by paddies and ponds. No crickets, no wind through the trees, no sound at all. I woke at 2 in the morning. The room was dark as ink, only a thin thread of moonlight coming through the window crack,
drawing a short, pale line across the tile floor before dying out. I lay still and listened. Nothing. That absolute silence was the most frightening thing. It was not natural. It was too perfect, as though someone had deliberately filtered out every sound in the world from this room so that I might hear more clearly one particular thing. But I heard nothing. Then I smelled earth. Not the smell of soil after rain, not the smell of sun-baked earth, but the smell of cold earth, dark earth, deep earth. The smell of the layer of ground below the surface, where light and roots have never reached. As though someone had just lifted a handful of soil from several meters down and placed it right beside my pillow. I opened my eyes. Nothing there. Only the tile floor and the darkness, and the thin trace of moonlight that had shifted slightly since before. But the smell remained, sitting in the air like something very light that refused to dissolve. Followed me into sleep until morning.
The first 3 days in Dong Am passed like water through cupped hands. I rose early, ate the plain rice porridge Mrs. Tu had cooked, its steam curling up in the small dark kitchen, then picked up my survey bag and went out to measure, sample, and record. Under the slanted light of those late October mornings, Dong Am Cemetery laid bare its rows of neglected graves standing in silence. Moss had covered the inscriptions on the stone markers so thoroughly that many could no longer be read, the names of those lying beneath them worn to nothing. Wild grass grew dense between the narrow paths, with the occasional small purple wildflower rising up through the grass alone and unpicked. The air inside the cemetery thickened in a way that was hard to describe, as though the air here was heavier than air elsewhere, carrying something that ordinary air does not carry. But there was one thing I could not stop looking at: the banyan tree. Right at the center of the cemetery stood an ancient banyan so wide that 4 adults stretching their arms could not encircle it. The bark was rough and black, split into vertical ridges like healed wounds turned to deep scars. Aerial roots hung down from the upper branches like gray curtains, weaving together into thick screens that hid the base of the tree. The canopy was dense enough that even midday sun could not pass through, creating a circle of solid shadow directly below, like a well of darkness open in the middle of the day. At the foot of the banyan was a small shrine. The incense holder inside still had fresh incense sticks, not more than a week old, meaning someone had come out here to burn incense recently. But no one among the people I had met in the village seemed like someone who regularly visited the cemetery. I asked Mrs. Tu that evening, "Who burns incense at the shrine under the banyan?" She set her chopsticks down, looked at me. No one. Then asked whether the food was to my taste. On the 4th day, I found the strange grave. Set apart from the others, in a hidden corner behind the banyan, as though whoever placed it there had deliberately chosen the most concealed spot in the most concealed plot of land in the village. No marker, no name, no incense, no sign that anyone still remembered the person lying underneath. Just a mound of earth about 2 meters long and half a meter high. What made me stop was not the grave itself, but the earth surrounding it. Within a radius of about 1 meter from the edge of the mound, there was not a single blade of grass. The ground was smooth, hard, cracked into small lines like the lines on an old person's palm. While all around the rest of the cemetery, grass grew thick and lush, climbing up over other graves, growing up the bases of markers, pushing into the gaps between old bricks. Only around this grave was bare, as though the grass knew it should not grow there. I crouched down and took a soil sample by habit.
The earth was deep black, completely different from the reddish-brown of the surrounding soil. And when my fingers touched the surface of the earth, I pulled my hand back sharply. Cold. Not the ordinary cold of damp morning soil. Icy, as though beneath that thin surface layer was not earth at all, but a massive block of ice lying there, not melting with the seasons, not warming no matter how much sun fell on it. I stood up, looked around. No one there. Only wind moving through the kahuput canopy at the forest edge, creating that soft, rustling sound, vague and distant, like the sound of someone standing very far away in conversation with words too broken to make out. And I had a feeling. Not fear, not yet fear, but the feeling of being watched from a direction I could not turn around to check. That evening I told Mrs. Tu. She was washing vegetables by the well, the sound of water running through green bunches creating the one sound in Dong Am that felt genuinely fresh. When I mentioned the nameless grave, she went still, turned and looked at me. The look of someone who has just heard the thing they had been quietly dreading. "You touched that grave?" Her voice dropped. She went inside, took out incense, lit it at the altar, then came back and handed me 3 burning sticks. "Put these at the head of your bed before you sleep," she said. "And tonight, do not open the window." I stood in the yard holding the 3 burning sticks. Incense smoke curled up in the evening wind, mixing with the stale, familiar smell of Dong Am, creating something both warm and ancient, both like a temple and like somewhere else I did not want to name. And for the first time, I felt a genuine unease, not vague anymore, not explainable by tiredness or unfamiliarity, just unease, heavy and real, like the cold earth still clinging to the tips of my fingers.
I did what Mrs. Tu said. Pressed the 3 incense sticks into a glass at the head of the bed, closed the window firmly, lay down. Incense smoke spread through the small room, mixing with the smell of old wood and worn cotton sheets washed many times, creating an air so thick that breathing it in, you knew immediately this was someone else's home, not your own. The red glow of the incense at the head of the bed cast small trembling shadows on the wall, rising and stilling, keeping time with small drafts from somewhere in the closed room that had no clear source. I slept, deeper than I expected. I woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of knocking, light, even, from the direction of the window. Knock, knock, knock. I lay still and listened, did not dare sit up yet. Knock, knock, knock. Steady as a clock. Not fast, not slow, not hard, not soft. No emotion in it, no discernible purpose. Just the sound of knocking, repeating, patient as something that does not understand the meaning of exhaustion. I told myself, a branch, or some night bird that had settled on the window ledge. The knocking stopped. Silence. I let out a breath, lay back down, and at the exact moment my back touched the mattress, the knocking returned. But not at the window. From under the bed. Knock, knock, knock. From beneath the old wooden planks. A few centimeters from my back. Not hard, not soft, not fast, not slow, just even, patient, even, patient, as though whatever was beneath those planks knew I was lying on top of them and was simply waiting, in no hurry at all. I went rigid, did not dare breathe deeply, did not dare move, did not dare shift because I needed the sound to continue so I would know it was still there and still in the same place.
The knocking went on. 10 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, I did not know. I only knew that when it finally stopped, the sky to the east had begun to turn, the first light of the day coming through the window crack as a thin gray-blue line across the tile floor. And I was soaked through with sweat from head to foot, though the night had not been warm. In the morning, I bent down and checked under the bed. Cold tile under my palms. Nothing. Only dust, a few dead beetles dried to shells, and the old patterned floor tile. But just below where the head of the bed sat, on the surface of the tile, there was a small, dark mark. I bent close to look. Like someone had pressed a dirt-stained finger down onto the tile and pressed. A single print on the faded white tile surface. Black, damp, cold. I stood up, said nothing to Mrs. Tu, picked up my bag, and went to work.
On the 5th day, I brought a camera to the cemetery. I needed to photograph the current state of things for the report. Photographing the grave sections, the narrow path running through the cemetery, the ancient banyan tree, and the small shrine at its base. Ordinary work. The morning was clear and cool, dew still clinging to the tips of the grass, catching the early light and then releasing it. I photographed normally, nothing unusual. Back home that afternoon, I opened the photographs on my laptop. The desk lamp I switched on cast a yellow-orange circle in the room that had already begun to darken. Everything outside that circle fell into shadow. The photographs taken in the other parts of the cemetery were all normal. But the photographs taken near the banyan tree, every one of them had something in them that I had not seen when I was shooting. At the edge of the frame, near the Nameless grave, there was a pale white shape, long, thin, unclear. Not a lens flare, not a light reflection. I increased the contrast, zoomed in. Not a sensor error, not a light artifact. I'd been taking photographs long enough to tell the difference. It was a hand. 5 fingers spread open, rising from behind the Nameless grave, reaching toward the lens from below. Pale white, faint, like something that no longer fully belonged to the world of light, but was still present enough to show up on film. In the first photograph, the hand was on the far left side of the grave. Second photograph, it had shifted forward. Third, closer to the lens. Fourth, very close, the 5 fingers nearly filling one corner of the frame. The gap between photographs was only a few minutes, and I had seen nothing when I was shooting, nothing in the viewfinder, only the cemetery and the wind and the shadow of the banyan. I closed the laptop, sat still inside the small circle of lamplight, the rest of the room in shadow around me. The stale smell drifted in through the window crack from the garden outside, light and relentless. Then I convinced myself, sensor error. Old camera, sensor failing in one particular zone, completely explainable from a technical standpoint. That night, my phone lit up. A message from an unknown number. Don't photograph there anymore. I called back. No one answered. I sent a reply asking who it was. The message sent successfully, but no response ever came. The next morning, I opened the messages to check again. That entire conversation was gone. No trace of it anywhere in the phone, as though it had never existed. I stared at the blank screen, put the phone in my pocket, went to eat breakfast, went to work, as though nothing had happened. But something inside me had already begun to shift in a way I was not yet ready to acknowledge. In the second week at Dong Am, I began to hear them. At first I thought it was the wind. Dong Am often had wind in the afternoons, the kind that rose from the direction of the rice fields when the sun began to set,
carrying the smell of damp soil and grass baked in the heat all day. Wind through the kachuput canopy at the forest edge, through cracks in old brick walls, through old clay chimney stacks on the rooftops, creating all manner of strange sounds. But gradually I realized that inside those sounds there was something else. Not the sound of leaves, not wind through a gap, but the sound of a person, whispering very softly, very far away, as though someone was speaking on the other side of many thick walls, many thick layers of earth, and only the most scattered fragments of that conversation made it through to where I was. I could not make out words, only broken syllables mixed into the wind, sometimes there, sometimes not, sometimes near, sometimes far. Clearest was one afternoon when I was bent over taking notes at the southern edge of the cemetery, near the kachuput forest boundary. The late sun filtered through the sparse kachuput trunks in long diagonal beams, dust and spores drifting in those beams like miniature clouds. The last bird calls of the day echoed from the distant forest, scattered and tired. I was bent over writing when I heard it, clear enough to raise every hair on the back of my neck, clear as someone standing directly behind me and speaking into my ear. Go back. I spun around. No one there. Only the silent graves in the fading afternoon light, the banyan standing in its dense shadow, and the gray kachuput forest stretching out until it disappeared. Anyone there? I called out. No answer. The wind still moved, the leaves still rustled, but the whisper had stopped. I stood there for a moment in the last of the daylight, then turned back and kept writing. But my hand shook slightly holding the pen, not much, just enough that the letters on the page sat at a slightly different angle than they usually did. That evening I went to Mr. Sao Bin's house. Mr. Sao was the village head, a lean, quiet man with long fingers and skin bronzed brown from years of working outdoors. He was sitting on his porch, smoking pipe tobacco, watching the empty village road. The pipe drew a long pull of smoke, the tobacco smell rising warm and thick, then drifting apart into the dark. I sat down, lit a cigarette, and started asking. Mr. Sao told me about Hung, a friend of his from childhood, 16 years old, very bold, didn't believe in ghosts. One night, during the 7th lunar month, he went into the cemetery alone to prove there was nothing to be afraid of. The next morning, people found him sitting under the banyan, eyes wide open, hair turned completely white. Mr. Sao's voice stayed even as he said it, his eyes out on the road. A 16-year-old, hair white as an old man's. From then on, he could never speak again. Lived another decade or more, then passed. Never spoke a single word again. Mr. Sao paused, took another pull from the pipe. Smoke rose up and broke apart in the dark. His mother said something once. Mr. Sao's voice dropped. After that night, he liked to draw. He'd take coal and draw on the walls. He drew people, many people. But the people in his drawings had no faces. I sat and listened. The afternoon wind came through Mr. Sao's porch, carrying that familiar stale smell, the smell I now knew the name of. Then Mr. Sao said something no one had asked him to say. His voice was so even, it was almost strange. Back when Hung was still alive, I used to visit him. Once I asked him who he was drawing. He couldn't speak, but he pointed at himself, then pointed at the people in the drawings. He stood up and went inside, leaving me sitting alone on the porch with that sentence and the meaning he had not needed to state directly, but that I had already understood. Hung was drawing the people standing beside him. The people that only he could see.
On the 8th day, I found a new grave. Not newly built, newly appeared. In an open space I was certain had been empty the day before, there was now a small mound. Fresh earth, still damp, deep black, exactly like the soil of the nameless grave. No grass yet, nothing covering it, as though it had appeared in the night. And at the head of the mound, something protruded. I stood at a distance and looked. My heart beat slowly and heavily with each passing second. A hand, rising up from the earth. Not exposed by sinking soil or erosion, not a root or branch. 5 fingers spread, skin pale, nails long, the hand frozen in the posture of someone reaching upward, trying to break through. As though someone beneath had raised their hand in the darkness, and the hand had pushed through the thin layer of earth above, but the rest of the body could not follow. On the ring finger there was a silver ring. Simple, thin, with characters engraved on the face. I was standing too far away to read what they said. I did not go closer, did not take a photograph, only looked for a moment, then turned and walked quickly out of the cemetery, not looking back. That evening, Mrs. Tu finally told me everything. The oil lamp on the table burned, its pale yellow flame wavering with the small drafts coming in through door gaps, making our shadows on the wall move and be still, move and be still. She sat across from me, both hands wrapped around a cooling cup of tea, eyes looking down, like someone who had just decided to say something kept too long. "That nameless grave," she began. "No one in the village knows who lies beneath it. It was there before this village was established. When the first people came to clear this land, the grave was already there. No marker, no name, nothing. As though the earth had simply raised itself up without needing anyone to do it." She took one sip of the cold tea. The sound of it passing her lips was small and dry in the silent room. "People say that whoever touches that grave," she continued, "will begin to see things, hear things, and gradually they will be pulled toward it. Not during the day, at night, in sleep." "Sleepwalking?" I asked. She shook her head, her voice dropping lower. "Not sleepwalking. Sleepwalking means you go and then you come back. This is different. You go and you don't come back." Then she told me about her husband, Mr. Tu, a well digger, the man whose altar photograph showed a kind face under a faded green army cap from when he was young. One time digging a well for a house near the cemetery, about 3 or 4 meters down he hit a cavity. Not a natural cavity, with walls, with sides, as though someone had dug it long before. He was curious. He climbed in, followed the tunnel. Half an hour later he came back up. She said this and her voice began to tremble. His face was gray. She looked at the oil lamp. I asked him what he saw. He wouldn't tell me clearly, only said there were people down there, many people, standing in a dark room, still, not moving. Eyes closed, but he knew they were not dead. Not dead, but not alive either. They were just standing there, waiting. 1 month later, Mr. Tu became ill. No doctor could identify what kind. He just grew thinner, more hollow, like a plant deprived of water, slowly fading. Before he died, he held her hand. "Don't let anyone go down there again," he said. "They are waiting. Don't give them more people." The oil lamp wavered. Mrs. Tu's shadow on the wall swayed and went still. On the 10th night at Dongam, I woke at 3 in the morning. Standing. Not standing in the room. Standing in the yard.
bare feet on cold, bare earth, the night damp of the ground seeping up through my soles. Still in my pajamas, hair loose, face turned toward the slope at the end of the village, where the darkness was thick even under the thin moonlight of that night. A young moon, its light weak enough only to lay a gray-silver wash across the yard, making the puddles left from the afternoon rain glitter like scattered pieces of broken mirror across the ground. I stood there and knew immediately without needing to think, that I had walked out of my room while asleep, had walked through the sitting room, had opened the front door, had stepped down off the threshold, had walked to the yard, all while knowing nothing. And if nothing had woken me, if I had not woken exactly now, I would have kept walking. Through the gate, out to the village road, up the slope, into the cemetery. I trembled back inside, locked every door with every latch available. The next night, I tied a nylon cord around my ankle, the other end tied to the bed frame. If I sleepwalked, the cord would hold me. In the morning, the cord was snapped. Not cut, not untied. Snapped from one end as though a very strong force had jerked it free in the night. And I was standing on the village road 200 meters from Mrs. Tu's house in the pale light of early morning that had not yet decided to be day. My feet caked in mud. Morning dew settled on the shoulders of my pajamas. The third night, I stacked furniture against the door of my room. If I sleepwalked, I would have to climb over it, and hopefully the noise would wake me. In the morning, the furniture had been moved to one side, neatly, carefully, not knocked over, not kicked aside, moved piece by piece, as though someone, or me in my sleep, had stopped, looked at the pile blocking the door, and calmly lifted each piece out of the way, then opened the door and walked out. I woke when one foot had already stepped onto the first stone of the slope leading up to the cemetery. Damp slope earth under my bare heel. The smell of night grass, heavy and dark all around. And above on the slope, the darkness of the cemetery was solid as a wall. I stood there and looked up. That darkness above was not like ordinary darkness. It was denser, heavier. Not the absence of light, but the presence of something else, lying in wait up there. And in that moment, standing between sleep and waking, I thought of my mother. I did not know why she came to mind then. Only that her image was there in my head, clearer than it had been in years, her hand holding mine in that white hospital room when I was 17 years old. And behind the solid darkness of the slope, I felt as though there was a light. Not the light of a lamp or the moon, but the warm glow of a place where someone was present, of a place that was not empty. I stepped backward, turned around, ran back toward the house, and my tears ran the whole way home in the dark. Not entirely from fear. On the 15th day, Mr. Sao led me to meet the old woman, Mrs. Nam Tao, 93 years old, the oldest person in Dongam village. She lived with her granddaughter in a small thatched house at the far end of the hamlet, one of the last remaining thatched houses in the village. The thatch roof had gone dark brown over the years, each bundle of grass layered over the next like strata of time. The earthen walls were plastered with straw and pond mud, now cracked into a fine network of lines, like the map of dried riverbeds. The front yard had a few clumps of lemongrass growing tall, their scent drifting light in the morning wind, the only smell in Dongam that had nothing to do with the cemetery. She lay on a wooden platform bed, wrapped in an old, faded blanket. When I stepped in, her eyes were closed. But before her granddaughter could say anything, she opened them. Eyes clouded over, covered in a thin film like dried frost. But when they found me, I had the strange feeling that she was seeing more than those eyes should have been able to see. "You touched the grave," she said, her voice small but clear. No preamble, not a question, a statement. I asked how she knew. She said, "I can smell it. You have the smell of the cemetery earth on you. That smell cannot be washed off. It has already gone into your skin." I unconsciously lifted my wrist and smelled it. Only soap. But the old woman looked at me with those clouded eyes, and I knew she was not speaking lightly. She told me about Ba Mu, slow and even, like someone reading aloud from a book memorized in childhood. Long ago, so long ago, this land had no name. There was a woman. She lived alone at the edge of the settlement. No one knew her name. No one knew where she had come from or how long she had been there. Only that she had been there before anyone else arrived, and she would be there after everyone was gone. People called her Ba Mu. She knew medicines, knew charms, knew how to speak to things that were not people. Then one day, she disappeared. No one saw her go. Only one day, someone looked in at her house and found the door open. The house empty. No body. Nothing. And in the cemetery that morning, a new grave had appeared. No one had dug it. No one had buried anyone. It was simply there, as though the earth had raised itself up and received her. "Ba Mu is earth," the old woman said, her voice steady as wind through the lemongrass outside. "She is not a person. She is not the soul of someone who died. She is the thing that was here before there was grass, before there were people, before there was anything that knew its own name. And she will be here after everything is gone. She does not harm anyone," the old woman continued. "She only holds. She holds everything that belongs to earth. The dead belong to earth. The graves belong to earth. And any living person she becomes aware of, she wants to hold as well. When you touched her grave, she became aware of you." I asked if there was any way to stop it. The old woman closed her eyes, sat still for a long time, long enough that I thought she had fallen asleep. Then she spoke. "There is one way. Ba Mu died without a name. The grave has no marker, no name. No one remembers her. She has been forgotten for a very long time. And what she truly wants is not a person, not a body, but to be remembered, to be called by name, to be known to have existed. Give her a name, carve it on a marker, and place it on the grave. Any name. Let her know that someone remembers her." I sat quietly. The lemongrass scent drifted in through the small door gap, and in my mind, I thought of my mother. The old woman opened her eyes and looked at me. "You have someone you haven't visited," she said. Not a question. I did not answer. "Ba Mu knows that. That is why she chose you." That sentence followed me out of the small thatched house, followed me all the way home under the already high morning sun. She chose you. One day before meeting the old woman, on the 14th day, I had found the tunnel. Behind the small shrine at the base of the banyan, where the aerial roots hung so thick they formed a natural wall, I cleared away earth and fallen leaves and found a round hole directly beneath one of the large roots. When I cleared the covering layer, cold air rose up from below, like the breath of something that had just opened its mouth, carrying the smell of damp and mold, and that other smell, the sweetish smell, like wilted flowers, like rotting fruit, like the smell of something that had waited a very long time in darkness with no wind.
I shone a flashlight down. The darkness swallowed the beam after a few meters, but in the range of the light, the earth walls were smooth and even, not natural collapsed soil. Someone had dug this hole, dug it a very long time ago, because the earth walls had stabilized and roots had grown through them in multiple places. I lay flat and pushed my head in, shining the light deeper, and saw the stairs. Steps cut into the earth, leading down, disappearing into the dark below. Part of me wanted to go down. A part I could not control, a part I suspected was no longer entirely mine. It wanted to follow those stairs, wanted to know what was below. I had nearly done it, had already lifted 1 foot into the mouth of the hole. Then I heard T's voice calling my name from the edge of the cemetery. The voice of a 12-year-old child, clear and unguarded, cutting through the near-hypnotic state that had been settling over me. I startled, pulled my foot back, sat up, breathed hard. And before I stood up, before I pushed earth back to cover the hole, I heard from somewhere below, from very deep, a sound of breathing. Not mine. Slow, even, deep and long, like the breathing of something very large, very ancient, sleeping in the earth since before anyone had set foot on this land, that had just sensed the weight of someone standing above it. I sat in Mrs. Tu's yard with the small stone marker Mr. Sow had brought. The afternoon was quiet. Bird calls echoed from the direction of the Kachuput forest, scattered and tired. The smell of someone's cooking fire began spreading in the wind. I held the chisel and the pen, looked at the smooth, flat stone face. What name do you give to something that existed before names? Then I thought of my mother. She passed when I was 17. She died in a hospital far from home. No one beside her but me. And I had not visited her grave in 15 years because I was afraid. I understood something sitting here with the stone in my hands. How important it is to be remembered, not for the dead, for the living. The living need to remember not because the dead need it, but because if we do not, a part of ourselves gets left behind in that grave with the person we lost. I picked up the chisel and carved into the marker, Ba Mu, Keeper of Earth, remembered. The sound of chisel on stone rang out in the quiet yard, steady and clean, each strike leaving a small white mark in the blue-gray stone face. 3 nights after placing the marker on the grave, Dong Am was quiet. I slept well, no sleepwalking, no knocking. I began to think it was over. I was wrong. The 4th night after placing the marker, at 9 in the evening, the power went out. Not just Mrs. Tu's house, the entire village of Dong Am. But looking through the door crack, the neighbors' lights were still on. Only this village had gone dark, like someone had drawn a black curtain between Dong Am and the rest of the world. Then I heard the earth vibrate. Not a large earthquake, just a tremor, light and steady, passing up through the house floor, through the tile, up into the soles of my feet where I stood. Like the breathing rhythm of something enormous lying beneath the entire village, waking from a very long sleep. The cups on the table rang softly against each other. The water surface in the tea kettle trembled into small spreading rings that expanded and faded.
Then came the sound of something beating up from beneath the floor. Thud, 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 slow and heavy as hammer strikes, not from the door, from the earth, from beneath the floor where we were standing. Mrs. Tu gripped my hand. Her hand was cold and trembling slightly. "It's coming," she whispered into the dark. "You named her. You woke her. She's not sleeping anymore." The two of us ran outside. On the village road, under the thin, pale moonlight, I saw them. Dozens of people, standing scattered along both sides of the road, between the shadows of fences and gates. Eyes closed, bare feet, faces blank as white pages. All of them walking, slowly, steadily, one step at a time, all in the same direction, toward the slope at the end of the village. No sound of footsteps, no sound of breathing, no rustling of clothing as bodies moved. They moved in absolute silence, like the shadows of themselves. Mrs. Tu whispered, "They are asleep. Ba Mu is calling them out." I looked and recognized face after face. Mr. Sao Bin, the village head. Mrs. Hai Nok, the woman who always smiled, but whose smiles never reached her eyes. And T, the 12-year-old boy who had called my name at the cemetery edge that day. Walking, eyes closed, small bare feet on the cold dirt road. Small among the larger figures moving in the dark. I ran to T, grabbed his shoulder and shook. The boy did not wake. Shook harder, still did not wake. He kept walking forward, eyes still closed, as though the hand I had on his shoulder did not exist. I let go, looked toward the slope. Then I remembered the community hall at the front of the village, the large drum in front of the hall. I ran. The road was dark. I stumbled and fell several times, knees hitting the ground, hands hitting the ground, got up and kept running. The sleepwalking figures on both sides of the road showed no reaction as I ran past. They only kept walking, toward the cemetery, slowly and unstoppably. When I reached the drum, I could not find the drumstick in the dark. I used my fist. Boom! The drum sound burst out, tearing through the night's silence, ringing across the village like nearby thunder. I struck again. Boom! 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 Striking with everything I had, striking as though the lives of the whole village depended on this sound. On the village road, the sleepwalking figures began to slow, and then something happened that I had not expected. Before any of them fully woke, in one brief moment, all of them turned their heads at the same time, toward the drum, toward me. Their eyes opened, but these were not the eyes of someone waking. The pupils were clouded, not reflecting the moonlight.
I understood in that moment what was happening. The drum had not woken them. The drum had drawn Ba Mu's attention toward me. And the whole village stood frozen as her shadows looked through their eyes toward where I stood. I kept striking the drum, striking to take everything onto myself so others could slip free. And gradually, one by one, they came back fully. Eyes clearing, confused, frightened, but present. Mr. Sao ran to me. "What is happening?" I looked toward the cemetery, said 3 words. Ba Mu is awake. The next morning, the village gathered in the community hall yard. Under the early light that had not yet decided to be warm, people sat together, stunned and frightened, every one of them telling the same story. Falling asleep, hearing someone call their name, walking, then waking up standing in the middle of the road. "Bring in a spirit medium," someone said. "What spirit medium would dare go into that cemetery?" another said.
"Leave the village," an old woman said, her voice trembling. "Go where? We've lived here our whole lives. Where would we go?" I sat quietly listening and thought. I had made an error. I had put a name on Ba Mu's grave, thinking it would let her rest. But I had understood wrong. Giving her a name did not put her to sleep. It woke her. Because now she knew someone remembered her. Now she was no longer alone. Now she wanted to hold. To make her let go, it was not enough to remember her from a distance. I had to go down and meet her, had to speak to her directly. I stood up in the middle of the gathering. "I don't know what she wants," I said, "but I know she's lonely. I'll go down." Silence. "Down where?" Mr. Sao asked. "The tunnel under the banyan. Ba Mu is down there. I need to meet her." "You're out of your mind," someone said. "Who goes down there and comes back up?" "Mrs. Tu's husband did," I said. "He died a month later," Mrs. Tu said, her voice catching. "I know." I looked at Mrs. Tu. He didn't know what to say to her. I'm not certain I do either, but I understand her better than he did. No one asked me to explain how, perhaps because no one had any other answer. That afternoon I went back to the cemetery, brought a flashlight, a rope, and one stick of incense. No weapons. Mr. Sao walked with me to the mouth of the tunnel, tied one end of the rope to a banyan root, the other end around my waist. If I was not back up in an hour, he would pull. I stood in front of the tunnel mouth. The afternoon wind moved through the cemetery, dry leaves rustling, the smell of earth and tree mixed together. Under the ancient banyan, shadow was thick even though afternoon had not yet become evening. I took a long breath, then stepped down. 50 steps. I counted each one. The air grew colder with each step, the cold of air that had never been touched by sunlight, the ancient damp cold of deep earth. My breath made small fog in front of me that vanished immediately in the dark. The smell of mold grew heavier, and that sweetish smell, the smell of wilted flowers, of time accumulated without wind, of waiting with no end in sight, deepened with each step I went further down. The room appeared at the last step, round, ceiling about 3 meters high, entirely earth, no brick, no concrete, nothing human-made, only earth pressed hard over thousands of years. And along the walls, they stood. Dozens of people, backs against the earth walls, eyes closed, arms hanging at their sides, still as carved figures. They wore clothing from many different eras, some in old-style long tunics, the fabric rotted through in places, but still holding shape. Some in the dark brown peasant cloth of an earlier generation. Some in modern clothing, not different from what you would see on any city street. And on the skin of every one of them, earth had already begun to settle. Layer by thin layer, fine as paper, covering faces, hair, clothing. Not dirt, earth, slowly, patiently, making them part of itself. And in the darkest corner of the room, I saw a young man, standing facing the earth wall, drawing with his fingers. Simple lines, nothing elaborate, but clearly human figures. The people standing around him, Khanh, Mr. Sao's childhood friend, who had gone into the cemetery alone on a 7th lunar month night long ago and had not come out. Still standing here, still drawing. In this darkness, in this earthen room, for all those decades.
At the center of the room, on a small circular mound, was the root of a tree. Not wood, earth compacted into the shape of an ancient tree root, black and hard as something that had been there before the concept of a tree existed. Roots spreading across the floor, climbing the walls, passing through the ceiling, reaching upward and upward, all the way up to the banyan on the surface. The ancient banyan was not a tree. It was Ba Mu's arm reaching up out of the ground toward the light. And in the center of that earth root, in the trunk itself, a face. Not clearly defined, only faint lines on the earth's surface, like the impression of something that had pressed against it too long. 2 deep eye sockets, a nose ridge, lips pressed closed. The face of a very old woman, older than anything on the surface of this earth. And those earth eyes were open, looking at me. I wanted to run. Everything in my body was screaming, "Turn and run!" But I did not run. I stood there in the narrow, cold beam of the flashlight, in the earthen room deep below the ground, and I spoke. Ba Mu. My voice rang in the earthen room and then went flat. No echo, as though the earth had swallowed the sound into itself. But those earth eyes were still looking at me. The earth lips moved very slightly. She was listening. "I know you want to hold," I said, my voice trembling, but I kept it loud enough to hear. "I know you have been holding for so many years. Holding the living, holding the dead, holding everything. Because you are afraid of being forgotten. Because you are afraid of being alone." The air in the room shifted. I cannot describe it another way, only that the space around me seemed to go quiet and to turn toward me, listening. "I understand that," I continued, my voice smaller now. "I understand, because I am the same. I have a mother. My mother passed when I was 17 years old. She died in a hospital far from home, and I was the only one sitting at her bedside that last night. And for 15 years, I never visited her grave once." I stopped, swallowed. Not because I forgot her, but because I was afraid. Afraid to remember. Afraid to stand before her grave and admit to myself that I had left her alone for too long. The earth root trembled very slightly, as though something inside it had just moved after a very long stillness. "Ba Mu is lonely," I said. "I know that. She has been here alone for a very long time. No one remembered her. No one called her name. No one knew she had ever existed. I understand what that kind of pain feels like. I understand because I have done the same thing to my mother for 15 years. I looked at the people standing along the walls. Khanh had stopped drawing, standing still, his hands lowered, listening. The people she holds here, they also have people who remember them. Their family still burns incense for them, still calls their names. She holds them here, and they can no longer hear those words, can no longer hear their own names being called from the living. A long sigh from the earth face, long and heavy and ancient as the sigh of the land itself, as though a vast stretch of ground had exhaled after holding its breath for a very long time. "I will go back," I said. "I will visit my mother's grave. I will not leave her alone anymore. Please let go. Let them go. Let me go. And you will not be alone, because I promise I will remember you. I will tell your story to others. You will not be forgotten."
The earth eyes slowly closed, as slowly as the sun setting below the horizon after a long day. The earth roots on the floor began pulling back, one by one, withdrawing toward the tree root, silent and slow as a tide going out. Earth on the people along the walls began to fall away, dropping to the floor in small pieces, thin layers, the sound of falling so small as to be nearly inaudible. Khanh straightened up, eyes still closed, but his hands had lowered to his sides. The posture of someone standing, not someone carrying out a task with no end. The earth root collapsed, not with noise, just dissolving silently into earth, into dust, like something that had never had a definite shape. The room began to cave. The ceiling cracked. Earth fell in large sections, the sound of the earth collapsing rising loud. I turned and ran. Down the tunnel, earth falling behind me, earth falling in front of me. The rope around my waist pulled taut, Mr. Sao pulling from above. I gripped the rope, climbed the stairs. 50 steps now climbed, while the sound of earth collapsing came from below. When my head came up out of the tunnel mouth, afternoon sunlight fell directly into my eyes. Bright, warm, real enough that I nearly wept.
Mr. Sao pulled me out. The tunnel mouth behind me collapsed, earth filling it in, disappearing as though it had never been there. I lay down on the grass, looked up at the sky. For the first time since coming to Dong Am, the sky was blue without a single cloud. Deeply, widely, genuinely blue. The ancient banyan behind me was dead, every leaf fallen, the canopy bare, the thin branches reaching up like skeletal fingers into the open sky. The trunk split down in deep vertical cracks. The aerial roots dried and curled like the hair of the dead. It died at the same moment Ba Mu did. I left Dong Am 2 days later. The morning before I left, I went to the cemetery one last time. The early morning sky, dew still clinging to the tips of the grass, the first light of the day coming through the Kajuput canopy in long diagonal beams, filtering down across the narrow paths between the grave rows. Under morning light, Dong Am Cemetery looked different. Still sad, still old, still with moss-covered markers and wild grass growing dense, but no longer carrying that feeling of being watched from somewhere unidentifiable. The small stone marker stood straight and steady at the head of the nameless grave. Ba Mu, keeper of earth, remembered. I lit incense, stood before the grave as the sandalwood smoke curled up in the morning wind, drifted with the breeze, and dissolved. Did not say much, only said one sentence: I will keep my promise. Then I left. On the bus back to the city, I took the piece of paper from my bag, the worn piece of paper with my mother's cemetery address. I looked at it, then I called and booked a ticket for the weekend. For the first time in 15 years, I would visit my mother. 1 month after leaving Dong Am, I received a letter from Mrs. Tu Huang, written by hand on lined paper torn from a school notebook, the writing of an old person, slightly trembling and tilted. Dear Khanh, since you left, the village has been very quiet. Nights are peaceful. The wind is less cold. No one sleepwalks anymore. The banyan tree has died. Some of the men in the village want to cut it down and clear the roots. But I told them to leave it. Let it stand there as a witness to what happened here. There is one thing I want to tell you. The day you went down into the tunnel, when Mr. Sao pulled you up, I was standing at the edge of the cemetery watching.
After the tunnel collapsed, I looked out across the graves. On Mr. Tu's grave, the one I chose as far from the banyan as I could find, wildflowers had bloomed. Every color, yellow, purple, white, growing thick across the grave face, as though the earth had just decided to allow them. In all those decades, not once had flowers grown on his grave. Now they have. I stood and looked at those flowers for a long time. Then I understood. Ba Mu had let him go. He is truly resting now. Thank you, Mrs. Tu Huang. I read the letter, folded it carefully back along the old creases, sat still for a moment in my city room with the noise of traffic outside the window, then put the letter in the desk drawer beside the piece of paper with my mother's cemetery address. That piece of paper was now unfolded, no longer sitting at the bottom of a bag. The story should have ended there, but it did not. 6 months after leaving Dong Am, I began to notice that something about me had changed permanently. Every morning when I woke up, I washed my hands. The water ran slightly dark before clearing, and when I dried my hands on the towel, I found the darkness there. Under all 10 fingernails, there was earth, black, damp, icy cold. I scrubbed it clean. The next morning it was back. I live on the 12th floor of a high-rise apartment. No garden, no soil. Nowhere I could go in my sleep to come back with earth under my nails. But every morning the earth was there, black and cold and damp, like soil from deep underground. And sometimes, on rainy nights, when rain strikes the city windows and the streets below shimmer with blurred street lamp reflections in the wet, I wake up, standing before the window, looking down at the road 12 floors below. Down below is the city, alive with light and movement and real, everything continuing as though the world had not changed at all. But I stand there, bare feet on cold concrete flooring, hands on the window frame, and in the state between sleep and waking, I hear a woman's voice, low, hoarse, heavy as the smell of earth. I remember you, Khanh. I always will. Then I wake fully. The voice dissolves like the smell of earth dissolves after rain. I go back to bed, lie down, listen to the rain on the window, try to sleep.